Ryan Seacrest here. When you have a busy schedule, it's important to maximize your downtime. One of the best ways to do that is by going to ChumbaCasino.com. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino games like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire that you can play for free for a chance to redeem some serious prizes. So hop on to ChumbaCasino.com now and live the Chumba life. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, well, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. We got a really, really big show for you today. Okay, there's a guest I've been trying to get for a long time, Tony Ortega, who's an expert on the Church of Scientology. And I just found out today, it's the same Tony Ortega that was the editor of the Village Voice all those years. I had no idea the two guys were the same guy. But Tony's the author of The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, and you can find him at his website, TonyOrtega.com, which is the underground bunker. Tony, are you there?
I sure am, Ed. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. I had no idea you were the guy from the Village Voice.
Yeah, I was editor-in-chief there from 2007 to 2012.
Yeah, because I always knew Tony Ortega from the Church of Scientology. I didn't know that till today.
You know, I've been writing about Scientology now for 20 years. I started in 1995. I was actually living in Phoenix then. And it's just something that I've always paid attention to and written about over the years. And while I was at The Voice is when things really exploded and the anonymous folks showed up, and it just really changed the game. So I've just been, continuing on writing about it, learning about it, and talking to my inside sources, and having a lot of fun.
Yeah, I actually, I think I first ran across you in alt Scientology back in the old days, like 95, 97, and using it.
Yeah, I worked a little bit on ARS. The Usenet group, Alt Religion Scientology. I didn't contribute much. I was just, at that time I was a reporter and I was reading about it, that kind of thing. Also, just real quick, I just want to mention my website is actually TonyOrtega.org.
Ooh, I'm sorry about that. TonyOrtega.org. Okay, so now, so many times nowadays when you hear an interview about the Church of Scientology, they want to talk about John Travolta or Tom Cruise or this recent movies that just came out, the Going Clear and this kind of stuff. But when you look at the origins of the Church of Scientology and the connections to Crowley and even the Manson family and the Process Church and what's his name, Jack Parsons, and all of that, how come that focus? There isn't as much focus on that whole history.
I thought they actually did a pretty good job in Going Clear, talking about those roots, at least to a certain extent. And, Crowley was mentioned, Parsons was mentioned, and they also talked about Marjorie Cameron. And Alex Gibney the director had actually found some footage of Marjorie Cameron that I had never seen. It was pretty mind-blowing. So I think Larry Wright, who wrote the book and then was behind the movie, has paid a lot of attention to that. And I think one of the things that makes his book Going Clear so good is that he really, some people kind of quickly go through the Hubbard material to get to celebrities like you're talking about.
Right.
But if you read Going Clear, that first third of that book is such a thorough investigation of Hubbard and really unsparing. I got to tell you, I was really surprised at just how much Lawrence Wright really dug up the really interesting things about Hubbard and not very flattering things, including, as you're saying, the occult involvement. And there's been some other really interesting work recently. A professor at Ohio State, Hugh Urban, did a really interesting study comparing Crowley's work with Scientology to show just how much Hubbard did borrow from Crowley when he made Scientology. There's a lot of parallels, and there's just no question that Hubbard was influenced a great deal by Crowley.
Well, before we get to that, you mentioned Marjorie Cameron. I'm not familiar with that name. Tell me about that.
Well, when Hubbard demobilized from the war in 1945, he ended up in Los Angeles, and a mutual friend told him about Jack Parsons. And Parsons had this big house in Pasadena, and he only rented out rooms to other eccentrics. And he and Hubbard hit it off right away. At the time that they met, Parsons was dating a woman named Sarah Northrup. very soon after Hubbard started hanging out at the house, he stole her away. Parsons apparently wasn't too put out by it. What Hubbard and Parsons then set out to do, they had taken some of Crowley's ideas, and Crowley had, had proposed some ideas about how these rituals could be performed, and it would create a moon child. And Parsons and Hubbard decided to do that. And they, in order to do these sex magic rituals, they needed another woman for Parsons. And that's when he met Marjorie Cameron. And this was this woman, this striking-looking woman, redhead, that they decided, okay, this is the right woman. And so in 1946, Parsons and Hubbard and Marjorie Cameron performed these rituals they called Babylon working in order to produce the Moonchild, which they believed would become the Antichrist. And over a period of time, Parsons and Marjorie Cameron had sex while Hubbard was the scribe, they put it, and described and wrote down what was going on and did all these, ritualistic acts and stuff. Really crazy stuff, which the Church of Scientology does not want people to learn about, denies that it ever happened. And Marjorie Cameron went on to be a pretty important artist in her own right, very interesting person, very eccentric. There's been some new work recently about her, which I'm not really familiar with, but she's a fascinating person.
So what happened? Did she have kids through this process?
No Moonchild was born. And Hubbard and Parsons had a terrible falling out. What happened was that Hubbard came up with this scheme where he and Sarah were going to go to Florida, buy a sailboat, sail it around to California, and then sell it at a profit. And basically they just went to California with Parsons' money and just took off. They did buy a boat, but they never went back to California. Parsons eventually had to sue them. So, Hubbard was just basically conning his buddy. And so their black magic sort of ended sex magic ended after a short time.
But, the thing is, if you talk to the average person, who reads the National Enquirer and, knows about Tom Cruise and knows about John Travolta, they have no clue about any of that stuff.
I doubt it. By the time, Hubbard came up with Dianetics in 1950, and in his early lectures, he did talk about Crowley. He did mention my good friend Crowley. And if anybody had bothered to really take a close look at the Scientology he was developing in 1952, they would have seen the parallels to what Crowley had done. But Scientologists are not very curious about even their own organization. They read a book, they do a course, they do an exercise, but they're not really allowed to dig into the wherefores and the whys and the history. I talk to a lot of former Scientologists that have left the church who tell me that when they read websites like mine or Mike Rinder's or dig into a book like Going Clear or Russell Miller's book, Barefaced Messiah, they tell us that they learn a lot more about Scientology than when they were actually in it. The amount of information that you're given is doled out at a small amount. L. Ron Hubbard called it learning on a gradient. And you only give a small part of the time. And they really never get the full picture of who Hubbard was, where he came from, how he came up with these ideas. I bet Tom Cruise and John Travolta have probably never heard of Aleister Crowley.
You think so?
Yeah, they're very good at ignoring what they're not supposed to know.
Okay.
Travolta in particular, I know people that know him, and they say that he's just really good at blocking out anything negative about Scientology, any press about Scientology. John Travolta is convinced that L. Ron Hubbard is responsible for everything good in his life, the reason he became a star, the reason he has all the things in his life, and he just doesn't want to hear anything else that doesn't fit that model.
Gotcha. So he's like a true believer.
Absolutely, and so is Cruise. They're not, Travolta, everybody I've ever talked to that worked with him, knows him, are totally convinced, and I believe them, that Travolta is genuinely a very sweet man, really considerate, very nice. Cruise, I think, is a little bit more, he puts on a positive face, but he can also be very, brusque with the people who work for him. But the thing about Cruz is he's in really tight with David Miscavige, the guy that runs Scientology. Travolta's not. And I'm convinced, based on the things that Cruz has said to people that have told me, that Cruz and Miscavige truly do believe they are the two most important human beings on the planet. And the rest of us are basically deluded fools who don't realize we're living on a prison planet. And, Tom Cruise and David Miscavige have each other and no one else on their level. And that's why they're so loyal to each other. That's why they're able to block out all the negative things said about Scientology. But it's a different thing than with Travolta. Travolta just really has a great admiration for L. Ron Hubbard. Miscavige, he's not Miscavige's favorite. I don't even know if they talk much at all. But both of them, both Travolta and Cruz, really are true believers. And I have not seen any evidence that either of them is leaving, even though these tabloid magazines keep wanting people to believe that Tom's leaving. But I haven't seen any evidence of that.
Why don't we start at the beginning? You give us a little history of L. Ron Hubbard and his life and his official history that he likes to tell us, and then tell us the truth. That was really cool.
He really did lead an adventurous, amazing life. And the problem is that he just embellished everything. He was born in Nebraska on March 11th, 1913, but his family soon moved up to Montana and then to Washington State. His father was in the Navy, and so at a fairly young age, Hubbard got to go to places like Guam. And he really did see a lot of the world. He was a very young Eagle Scout, and at only something like 13 or 14 years old. He was a glider pilot in the 30s. I mean, he did all these things. The problem is, by the time he and the Church of Scientology get done with it, he's this incredible, person that's lived like no one else, and everything gets exaggerated. He was, they say that he was taming wild horses at 4 years old, and he was a blood brother of the Blackfeet tribe in Montana. He was the youngest Eagle Scout in all of history. He communed with shamans in China. I mean, none of that is true. But there is a truth that he did lead a very adventurous life because his father was in the Navy. And he flunked out of high school a few times. He had a hard time getting into college. He finally did, and then did a freshman year at George Washington University, and then was, by the time he was done with his first semester of sophomore year, he was done. He was failing everything. He took an early atomic science class and failed it. And that's the only record of any of that kind of class he ever took, and yet years later, in his books, he claimed to be a nuclear physicist. But he was, he was a tall tale teller from the beginning, which is why he was a good pulp fiction writer. And that's really where he, ended up, was in the 30s, he became very good at writing pulp fiction from cheap magazines, all different kinds, westerns, adventure stories, and then he started writing science fiction, and it really became what he became known for. He wrote some very good books. He wrote a book called Fear that people say ranked very highly. Harlan Ellison told me personally that he thinks it's a wonderful book. He wrote a book called Final Blackout that's considered good. But then he wrote a lot of stories that are just really very run-of-the-mill pulp fiction. And then the war started, and he wanted to get into it. And he managed to get himself a commission. And he did command 2 ships. It is true. But nothing like the Church of Scientology says. He captained, or he commanded a ship in Boston Harbor for a single day. And it was such a disaster, he was removed from command. Later, he then became commander of a ship on the Oregon coast, which was a sub chaser. And right after it got launched and was going on its maiden voyage, his ship and another ship engaged in a 35-hour battle, they claimed, with 2 Japanese subs, which they claimed they sunk. There was never any evidence of the subs, and the Navy brass later concluded that they had spent 35 hours depth charging a mineral deposit on the seafloor. From there, he sailed down the Pacific coast down to Mexico, and wrongly thinking that an uninhabited island was an American island, he used it for target practice. That became an international incident, and he was removed from that command. And that's it. I mean, he also, I think, went to Australia briefly, but he did not have a very distinguished World War II career. But, of course, by the time he gets done telling it, he said he was the first casualty in the Pacific Theater. He was machine gunned in Papua Guinea. He was, he broke his back and all this, and he was barely alive, and then used these new techniques of the mind he'd come up with that eventually became Dianetics to heal himself. But if you get his war records, none of that happened. He had an ulcer, he had hemorrhoids, and he had conjunctivitis, something like that. I mean, that's why he was in a hospital. But he was in a hospital in Oakland after the war, and eventually, like I said, made his way down to Los Angeles and met Parsons, and then got into the occult for about a year, and went through those bizarre sex magic rituals that I mentioned before. Hooked up with Sarah Northrop, was writing magazine stories again, and then eventually in 1950 they had ended up in New Jersey, and he came out with this book called Dianetics, and his life changed radically. I'm sorry, you going to ask me a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, did he have any intelligence background while he was in the military?
He did. He was probably a censor, meaning that he was, all letters that servicemen had to send out had to be opened, read, checked for, make sure they weren't sending out important information. He did some of that, but there's no evidence he was anything more than a low-level intelligence officer, and it was routine. There are people out there that want to believe he was this secret, the Church of Scientology wants people to believe that the reason he was doing, sex magic rituals with Parsons in 1946 was that it was an intelligence mission to break up black magic in America. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's not the case. And he was a guy that was a tall tale-teller who was really good at writing a lot of stories for magazines, who had an undistinguished naval career, and then decided in 1948 to start writing this book that he decided that he was the first person in history to understand how the human mind actually works. And that's what Dianetics is. And it's this, I'm always surprised when people tell me that they got into Scientology because they picked up Dianetics and it blew them away, because I've read every page of it, and I can tell you it's a bizarre book. It's misogynistic. It's as anti-science as possible. It's this, basically Hubbard took what little he understood about computers and tried to, at that time in 1950, and tried to apply it to the human mind. He said that on the one hand we have what's called an analytical mind, which is a perfectly recording computer, and then when we go through trauma and we're knocked unconscious, something called the reactive mind takes over and records all those traumas. And the problems we have as adults is that those traumatic incidences we had as a child get stored in something called engrams, and those engrams get re-stimulated later, and we relive that terror, and it holds us back. It messes us up. It causes our ailment. If we could just go back and re-experience those early traumas, we can talk them out and lessen them. And that was the basis of Dianetics. That's what caused kind of a craze in the summer of 1950. People around the country were trying this. And I'll tell you, there's no question there's something to it. I mean, if you sit down with somebody else who listens patiently as you talk about the tough things you went through in your childhood and growing up, of course you're going to feel better. I mean, there's no mystery to that. But Hubbard really believed that the engrams that were the most powerful, that the ones you really needed to get to in order to really clear yourself, it's called, occurred when you were in the womb. And a lot of what Dianetics is about is how to get people to remember what they went through as a fetus or even as a sperm or an egg. He believed that somehow things that happened to you when you were sperm or egg were stored in your brain somewhere, and you could bring that out. And so people in the summer of 1950 got together with these clubs, and a little of this was dramatized in Paul Thomas Anderson's movie The Master with Philip Seymour Hoffman. There's a scene where these people are trying to recreate what it was like to be in the womb. And there's no science, backing this up. And there's nothing Hubbard ever did was ever submitted to any kind of a scientific testing. It was a pretty story he told that, yeah, you can remember what it was like in mom's womb when mom and dad were having rough sex, and then they said something that stuck in your head, and 40 years later it's the cause of why you have an ulcer. And that's the basis of Dianetics. And it's never been something that most people were tempted to believe, but it's always had a small following of people that really thought it helped improve their lives. 1950 was a huge year for him. He made a lot of money. He got a lot of press. And then 1951 was probably the worst year of his life. His second marriage broke up. it got so bad between him and Sarah Northrop that he absconded with their child, Alexis, and went to Cuba. And if you see the movie Going Clear, Lawrence Wright does a great job explaining just how awful Hubbard was during this period. He said he told Sarah that he chopped up their child and threw her body parts into the river and stuff like that. Eventually, Sarah went to the press, and there was a lot of bad press for Hubbard. He was called a maniac, and eventually he was able to settle with her. She got the child back, but he went bankrupt through all of this. And so in 1952, he tried to regroup. And by this time, the people that liked his counseling and liked the idea of going back to the womb, they wanted to go back farther. They wanted to go back to previous lives. And Hubbard decided that that's where his thing was going, but he couldn't call it Dianetics anymore because it was in bankruptcy. So he came up with this in 1952 in Wichita and in Phoenix, Arizona. He came up with something he called Scientology. And this is the idea that you don't just go back to the womb. You go back to what happened to you in lives that happened millions, billions, even trillions of years ago. And that's what you pay. That's why Scientology is so expensive, is that you're trying to remember these things that happened on other planets billions of years ago, and that counseling gets up to $1,000 an hour.
Well, shit, it shouldn't come cheap.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
I'm sorry? Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, sure. I mean,
you got time travel, space travel?
Another planet. It's going to cost you money.
Let me ask you a question, though. But now, wasn't even Dianetics, there's some allegation that was plagiarism?
Well, I think, he took some ideas from Crowley. He took ideas from everywhere, but I don't know that Hugh Urban did a real good study of this, and he gave Hubbard credit for one thing. He said that he was somebody that put together a lot of other ideas into something that was new. But I mean, if you just look at the idea of sitting down with somebody and talking over your childhood and feeling better about it, that's psychoanalysis, right? I mean, so in some ways he was taking ideas from psychoanalysis, he was taking ideas from Crowley, he was taking ideas from other places. And then along the way, there are stories about how somebody would come up with something new to go along in Scientology. He would claim credit for it. He would suddenly become the author of what somebody else had written. That accusation has been made. But as far as Dianetics itself, I think we have to give him credit, at least, that he came up with something based on a lot of different ideas that were there at the time. And Hubbard was a great salesman. I mean, one of the ways he sold Dianetics early on to some people was he claimed that in 1938 was when he first had his first ideas about this kind of thing. But he had gone to the dentist, and the dentist put him under, under laughing gas. What's it called? I'm forgetting the
nitrous.
Anyway, nitrous oxide. Right. He put him under nitrous, and he had this bizarre experience where he felt that he had died and gone on to some other place, and he was given a vision of all human wisdom or something. And he sat down and wrote up something. It was something he called Excalibur, and the people that have seen it have described it. I've read those descriptions, and it's basically just sort of the basic, some of the beginning ideas that later became Dianetics. But what he's such a good salesman, what Hubbard would tell people was that he tried to get Excalibur published, but it was such explosive information that of the first 12 people that had read it, 6 had committed suicide. Right? Well, it's all complete nonsense, but it was his way of getting people amped up that, whatever Hubbard's coming out with is going to change the world. And so he was very good that way. He made people feel like they were being led into something very secret, something very exclusive. And the prices helped. I mean, that's another reason why Scientology is so expensive, is that if it's that expensive, it has to be really special, right? I mean, he was very smart that way. He knew how to sell something and how to convince people that they were joining something really exclusive.
Now, was he like popular in the press around that time? Because I guess he had just had the book. The book was a good seller, right?
He got some good press. People were impressed at how much the book sold, and there were definitely stories about, wow, this Dianetics thing is catching on. But from the beginning, he was just getting miserable press from people that were debunking the book, that were saying it was nonsense. I think Martin Gardner just eviscerated it in 1952, and either he or somebody else, I can't remember if it was him or if it was Scientific American, somebody said there was more nonsense per page than anything that had been published. I mean, right away, it was being, held out as just the work of a crank. And he resented that. He really resented that. And he was kind of a cold warrior. I mean, remember, this was the 1950s, and he very early on started developing some information control, and he directed his people about how to deal with reporters, and didn't want to see Scientology written about in the newspapers. That initial reaction, I think, really bothered him. But that's the way it's always been for 60 years. Is something like Going Clear comes out, and it's a great film. I'm very lucky I was in it, and it reached a whole new audience. But believe me, there have been thorough journalistic exposés of Scientology every decade. Right? In the 1990s, it was Time Magazine and the Los Angeles Times. In the 1980s, it was the St. Petersburg Times that won a Pulitzer for it. In the 1970s, it was Paulette Cooper and her book, The Scandal of Scientology. I mean, this organization, as secretive as it is, has been laid bare time after time after time. And I guess people just have a short memory. They don't really remember it.
But now you mentioned all these big publications. Now, weren't they all sued, though, and harassed and all kinds of stuff?
Oh, yeah. Early on, Scientology sued anybody that wrote about them. Paulette was sued. The first substantial book about Scientology was a guy, George Malko, came out with his book in 1970 called Scientology, the Now Religion. And in the next year, Paulette Cooper and Stuart Vosper came out with books. And then the year after that, a guy named Robert Kaufman. All of those books were sued, and soon became almost impossible to get. When Hubbard died, and so there were years when after that people didn't try because they knew they'd get sued. When Hubbard died in '86, then there was another wave of books because now we can write about Hubbard. He's dead. Russell Miller's great, fantastic book, Barefaced Messiah. John Atek's fantastic book called A Piece of Blue Sky. Ben Coyne's wonderful book, L. Ron Hubbard, Messiah or Madman. All of those books were sued, and it became very difficult to get any of those. And it wasn't, and newspapers would get sued all the time. The real, battle royale was 1991. Time Magazine came out with a cover story called Scientology, Cult of Greed. I'm going to forget the whole title. Richard Behar wrote the story at Time Magazine. Devastating story. And it was at a time when Scientology had weathered the death of its founder. Hubbard had died in '86. Brought on his biggest star of all time. Tom Cruise started in '86, '87. And it was at its greatest extent. Marty Rathman had told me that Scientology was probably at its biggest in around 1990 with about 100,000 people. And then in 1991, Time Magazine comes out with this devastating cover story. And Scientology sued Time for $416 million. And they ultimately lost. Time Magazine was completely exonerated. But it took several years, and they spent $6 to $8 million defending themselves. That created a big chill. And there were definitely other publications in the 90s that were covering Scientology, specifically Richard Libby at the Washington Post did fantastic work. But he got sued. And it was in the 90s, early 2000s, it was tough to get a story published about Scientology. Publications were very nervous because of what had happened to Time Magazine. Even though Time had won, it just cost so much money. But it wasn't until Tom Cruise in 2005 came out as sort of the ambassador of Scientology, and it backfired on him badly. That's when things started to loosen up again.
Now, initially, though, back with the big Time Magazine lawsuit, they were also going after any kind of dissenters, any kind of any person that was a member that was giving them any problems, like harassment, stalking. Yeah,
the roughest treatment they always say for their own people. Hubbard had spelled it out in a policy he called fair game, where he said that anybody that was considered an enemy could be sued, tricked, or lied to, destroyed utterly, without any punishment for whatever Scientologist did that. L. Ron Hubbard's son, L. Ron Hubbard Jr., also called Nibs, he described it. He said that for his father, it wasn't enough just to get even with somebody. If he considered you an enemy, he wanted you to lose your job, lose your home. He wanted you, lying in a gutter somewhere where he could stand over and laugh at you. That was the only thing that satisfied L. Ron Hubbard. And you can see it in the policies he passed he wrote in the 1960s that they've followed ever since. They go after people. They go after journalists. My book, The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, is about one of the persons that suffered the most. It was Paulette Cooper. She wrote her book, The Scandal of Scientology, in 1971, and they spent the next 14 years trying to destroy her in multiple operations. At one point, she was facing 15 years in federal prison for a crime she didn't commit that Scientology had framed her for. This is when they played very rough in the 70s. They were really out of control. But you're right, it's the ex-members that get it, the worst. And today, people like Marty Rappin, Mike Rinder go through constant harassment. It's just something that's built into Scientology that comes from Hubbard. And one of the things you have to know about Scientology is everything is based on the word of Hubbard. They literally call him source. Well, he died in 1986, and he can't change any of his words, but they still follow them to the letter. And so that's why in 2016, they're still doing things that really don't make sense today, but make sense to them from what he cooked up in the 50s and 60s.
Now, what about the whole thing about where they went after the Cult Awareness Network and they put them out of business and then took over their phone number and their offices and everything?
Yeah, that was a very deliberate operation. It took them many years. The Cult Awareness Network was a very effective organization that was causing Scientology a lot of trouble, as well as other organizations. And they set out to destroy it. And the way they did was actually a long, complex tale. That was the first story I wrote about Scientology 20 years ago. Was about a man named Rick Ross, who's a cult expert and is still going strong today. Just had a book come out that's doing well. Rick was referred by the Cult Awareness Network to a woman who had been part of a Christian church in Bellingham, Washington, and she wanted to get her kids out, and Rick specialized in Bible-based cults. And so he agreed to help her, and her one son was 14 or 15, and so they locked him in a hotel room and talked to him for 3 or 4 days to try to get him to leave the church. Well, his older brother, Jason Scott, also decided, I can't remember the details now, it's been 20 years, but he joined as well, and they brought him into the room as well. Well, he was 18. And at some point, Jason ran for it and got away. And so Rick Scott and Jason, Rick Ross and Jason's mother were charged. Although they were detained, and the DA was considering charges of kidnapping, because you can't do that. You can't hold an 18-year-old against his will, even if it's for, you're trying to help the kid. And the DA wasn't interested and dropped it. But the Church of Scientology then recruited Jason Scott as a plaintiff and said, listen, we're going to sue Rick Ross, and we're going to sue the Cult Awareness Network because they referred him. And the jury was not able to hear that the only reason this case was happening was because the Church of Scientology had recruited Jason Scott. The jury didn't get to hear that. They came back with a $5 million judgment against Rick and the Cult Awareness Network. Well, it bankrupted CAM. It bankrupted the Cult Awareness Network. And so Scientology went into bankruptcy court and bought the assets. And they kept the name, kept the phone number, and so ever since then, when you call up the Cult Awareness Network thinking that you're going to get information about cults, you don't know it, but you're calling the Church of Scientology. It's a very, very, complex operation they ran, and it's classic Scientology.
I had no idea. See, I thought that they were a party to that lawsuit. I thought they had an interest. But you're telling me that? Oh, I had no idea about that. Thank you so much.
It was just their attorneys, and they recruited Jason Scott.
Fascinating. Now, around that same time, too, didn't they burglarize the IRS office?
Well, that's earlier. That's
Okay.
That's also in my book about Paulette. That's called the Snow White Project, which the press mistakenly calls Operation Snow White. It's the Snow White program. I'm sorry. I make sure I get it right. Snow White program. L. Ron Hubbard came up with it in the winter of 72, 73 when he was hiding in an apartment in Queens. And what happened was, from Hubbard, like I said, in 50, he came out with Dianetics. 52, he came out with Scientology. He was in Phoenix. He was in Wichita. By 59, he had to get out of the United States. He was being investigated and sued. He went to England. He went to a place called East Grinstead and got this place called St. Hill Manor and flourished there for a few years. But by 1967, he'd worn out his welcome in England as well. So from 67 to 75, for 8 years, he took to sea and ran Scientology from a small armada of ships. And that's where the Sea Organization comes from, right? He had 200 or 300 young people on the ships with him. He called it the Sea Organization. We got sick of that by 75, came back to the United States, landed in Florida, took over a small town. And to this day, the people that work in the most inner core are called the Sea Organization, the Sea Org. Well, during that time, he got away from the ship for a few months and spent it in Queens, New York, hiding, and in 73. And he was really bummed out because there were fewer and fewer ports where they could stay. And he blamed it on the U.S. and the UK governments spreading information about him. And so he came up with an idea. We're going to go into every government agency that possibly has information about Church Scientology. We're going to get that information. And this was, the Freedom of Information Act was still pretty new then. I think President Johnson signed it into law in 67. This is 73. And so he said, we're going to go into every government office we can in every country in the world. We're going to get those documents. And he says in there, by any means necessary. Okay? And he named different countries' names in Snow White. So Italy was bashful, and, I think Stepmother was the UK, or the Hunter was America. I can't remember. I'm probably getting those all wrong. But anyway, he called it the Snow White program. And he came up with it in 73, and it kicked into gear in about 74. And they had these spies, and they infiltrated the IRS, the Justice Department. They had spies and moles, and they were burglarizing offices. They were walking out with government documents by the yard. This went on through 74, 75, 76, and just huge amounts of material. They were just making mockery of American government. I mean, my goodness, they were just walking into these offices, and after hours, some of them they had to actually break into. They were bugging the IRS. They were bugging IRS meetings. And then finally in 76, two of their spies were trying to get into a U.S. attorney's office in a courthouse, and a librarian stopped them and asked them, why are you here? Where's your ID? And when they came back a few days later, he saw them again, and this time he called the FBI. And the FBI stopped them, and they made up some stories and left, but not long after that, one of those FBI agents ran into a spy at the IRS building and arrested him. And the whole Snow White thing began to unravel. That was in 76. The chief spy there in D.C. was sent into hiding in Los Angeles, and Mary Sue Hubbard, L. Ron's wife, who was running all this, was just hoping that the FBI would not figure out who these guys were, why they were getting into offices, and that the Church Scientology had anything to do with it. But what she didn't realize, and what I told for the first time in my book, was that the FBI agent who figured all this out was a woman named Christine Hansen, and she was one of the first female agents in FBI history. And she was the one who'd been called to that library, and she was the one that took IDs from these guys that turned out to be fake, and she just wouldn't let it go. She's like, why were these guys there? What? And I know some of her fellow agents just like, who cares? It's not important. But she stuck with it, and she's the one that figured out that it was Church of Scientology and really stuck with it, and ultimately Michael Meisner, that chief spy, couldn't stand being in hiding for so long. He was in hiding for about a year. And he couldn't take it anymore, and he escaped from his Scientology handlers, ran to the FBI, turned witness, and 3 weeks later, the FBI, in the largest raid in its history to that time, raided the Church of Scientology on the morning of July 8, 1977, simultaneously in Washington, D.C., and two locations in Los Angeles. And it took a few years after that, but ultimately 11 top Scientologists, including Mary Sue Hubbard, were convicted and sent to prison. Now, it's amazing that the Church of Scientology survived that. You know, I mean, think about if that happened today.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. To me, I didn't even realize the extent of that story. Now, Ted Gunderson said that their intelligence capability.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you want to get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Abilities rival the FBI.
Well, there's no question that they made fools of foreign governments for years. There's no question, and I think the Guardian's office, it was called, which was their spy operations. I think it did rival the intelligence forces of at least small countries, if not the United States itself.
Now, how did they get these? What kind of training did these guys get? How were they getting the training and the background experience to do this?
You know, that's a really good question. They were young. They were eager. They you know, as L. Ron Hubbard wanted them to, they learned on a gradient. They just did a little of this, a little of that, and were to see if they could do this. If they could do this, and they go on to the next step. And then they would bring in some ringers. One guy they had, named Don Alverso, he was their break-in entering man. And he when they ran into a problem actually getting into an office, they'd call him in, and he would break in. And a couple of spies who worked with him said that he was just cool as a cucumber. Well, he had been a helicopter combat pilot in Vietnam. Okay, so I mean, Scientology knew what they were doing. They had some eager young kids with no training at all, learning to do a few things, but they also had some people with backgrounds that really knew what they were doing.
And that's interesting. But now, how did these guys with this kind of intelligence backgrounds, how were they gravitated toward Scientology? Were they just hired? Were they like mercenary type guys, or were they true believers as well?
You know, Merrill Veneer has a book out, and he talks about how he went through this process. He was going through law school, but he was getting into Scientology at the same time. He was in St. Louis. And like a lot of these other young people, he just really, I mean, Scientology wants you to believe it has all the answers. And if your life is going to be successful, you need to give yourself over to it. And he was just really loyal. He really believed in Scientology at the same time that he was working to become a lawyer. And he volunteered to do some of these missions for them, and he ultimately was paired up with Don Alverso. That's how we know some of the stuff about Alverso. And he watched Alverso work, and he just really admired him and wanted to do that himself. And so he became more and more involved. After he became an attorney, he continued to be a spy for the Church of Scientology. And what got him in trouble was that they had, after Hubbard was at sea and he had landed in Florida, they invaded this little town called Clearwater and basically took it over. They started secretly buying buildings under the fake name United Churches of Florida, and it wasn't until they bought a couple of the really significant buildings downtown that the word leaked out, this is really Scientology. The mayor of Clearwater at that time was a man named Gabe Cazares, and he was outraged, and he started making noise about it. He started going on the radio and stuff. And so, of course, the Guardian's office at the time, Scientology, worked up ways of targeting Gabe Cazares. And one way that they did was they got Merrill Veneer close enough to him that Scientology had said some libelous things about the mayor. And so the mayor had sued the Church of Scientology, but he didn't like the attorney he had. And while he was going through this, Merrill had gotten himself very close to the mayor. And so then when Mayor Gabe Cazares fired his attorney, he hired Merrill Veneer to be his attorney without knowing that Merrill was secretly a spy for the Church of Scientology.
This is unbelievable.
Isn't that amazing? And ultimately, Merrill was found out, and he was disbarred. And, you know, the documentation of that is unequivocal. The bar was disgusted. They said, you know, he tried to excuse it, saying, well, I was doing first, you know, I was exercising my freedom of religion, First Amendment rights. They're like, no way, that doesn't excuse it, And so, it was really an audacious thing. But I think it was, to answer your question, I think it was a combination of a talented young guy that really believed in a cause and was willing to do something that, hurt his own career because of it.
Now, what about recruiting? Now, the reason why twice in my life I was really heavily recruited to become a Scientologist. One time was when I was going through a traumatic time in my life. I was in a bad shape, when I was in a crossroads in my life, you might say. And another time when I had a really good business going on. And two times, I think I was targeted, that they knew about all this and they found me. What do you know about that?
Oh, that's exactly right. I mean, that's they look for people who have been through a difficult period. They look for people who've been successful. Those are both things that they look for. And a lot of the Scientologists I've talked to, when I ask them about, because there are people, very smart, successful people that have gotten into Scientology. I talked to a physicist who was in Scientology, okay? And he understands now that there's no real science in Scientology, but he should know. He's a physicist. But at the time, he said he'd been through a bad breakup. And Paul Haggis, in the movie Going Clear, he talks about how, he was in a relationship that he wanted to keep together. It was apparently hit a rough patch. And here's Scientology saying, we've got the answers. I mean, I think that's what appeals to some people. It wouldn't appeal to me, but it appeals to some people, the idea that we've got all the answers. We have certainty. That's basically what they sell to people, is certainty. And so they look for what they call it looking for someone's ruin. Is it a bad relationship? Is it they got fired at a job, or they're worried about their career, or they have family problems? What is it? Scientology finds out what that is, and then comes and says, we can take care of that. We've got the answers. We've got this amazing technology that's going to help you. And they also look for people that are successful. Hubbard's famous statement is, we make the able more able. They don't want handicapped people. They don't want people that are, you don't see Scientology operating a soup kitchen helping the poor, okay? They want successful people who have a lot of money to throw around, who want to be flattered and told, listen, you're going to join a special group, and we're going to take you to, you're going to become a new kind of human being. I want to say, only a small percentage of people that's ever appealed to. Scientology has never been a large organization. At its peak, it might have had 100,000 people around the world. But, there are people that's a tempting thing. And also keep in mind, a lot of the Scientologists that are in it today grew up in it and really didn't have a choice. And so they weren't recruited at all.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Now, you said they only had 100,000 top peak membership?
Yeah.
I had no idea, because now they had an office here on Sahara in Las Vegas. They had a center, I guess you call it. And it was a pretty big place. But, my church is near there, and there's no one going in and out of there now. And I think they sold the property as well. Now, are they still as big and powerful now as they ever were?
No, they're hurting badly. Like I said, what's been real significant about the last 10 years is that some top former executives have left. And they had access to enrollment documents. And so when Marty Rathman tells me that there was, the greatest extent was around the year 1990, and there were probably about 100,000 people, there's a reason why he knows that. I mean, he saw those documents. Another person that's very smart about this is Jefferson Hawkins. He was their top worldwide marketing guy. He was the guy that came up with that famous volcano TV ad back in the 80s. You remember that, don't you?
Sure.
So it was Jefferson Hawkins that came up with that. And he agreed with me on those numbers. And he said that when he left 2005 or 6, maybe it was more like, somewhere around there, he would estimate that worldwide Scientology had about 40,000 people. It had come down, I think Time Magazine started that slide, and it had come down from 100,000 down to about 40,000, and it's continued to shrink. I just did an interview with the most recent high-level management Scientologist to come out is a guy named Paul Burkhart. He left just in August 2013. And he told me that he saw international documents about the numbers of people they had in their facility. And he said based on that, he would estimate worldwide active Scientology participation at 10 to 20,000 people.
But wait a second.
So it's really shrunk down, and they still claim millions. They still claim millions, but in recent years they can't even fill those 2,000 person hall for their big international annual events. It's really tiny. I think there are more Scientologists than that, but they're just not participating. They don't want to have anything to do with David Miscavige and the church itself.
Okay, two questions. First of all, how did Miscavige get to power? How did it change hands to him?
It's a really interesting story. Janet Reitman does a good job talking about that in her book, Inside Scientology. Basically, Hubbard was just always on the run. He was always assuming that somebody was going to be after him. So he was either in semi-seclusion, or then in February 1980 he went into total seclusion. And he left with a young couple named Pat and Annie Broker, and he took off, and nobody in Scientology ever saw him again. Well, it turns out they went to, I think they went down to Laguna Beach for a while. They went to Culver City, and they ultimately ended up, after about 83, at a ranch east of St. Louis Obispo, a place called Creston, California. And that's where he spent the last 3 years of his life, in seclusion with Pat and Annie Broker and a guy that was a ranch hand named Steve Foss. And they, Pat and Annie were with him, but Hubbard was still in control of Scientology. The way they would do that was information had to go from Hubbard to the brokers. They would take it to people in Scientology. And David Miscavige, who had started out as this young kid who was in the filmmaking part of Scientology, he was an assistant cameraman, but he was close to Hubbard, and Hubbard liked him. He had moved his way up to the point where he became that control point. So Hubbard would come up with an idea. He'd give it to Pat and Annie. Pat would arrange to meet Dave Miscavige. They had a number of point locations in San Bernardino County. So one would be, and John Brousseau told me about all this because he would be with Miscavige for these things. So they would call and say 2 o'clock in the morning, hot dog, and that was code for 3 o'clock in the morning at a Denny's outside of Yucaipa or something. And Pat and Miscavige would meet, and John Brousseau would always be with Miscavige, and the two of them would just talk for an hour, 2 hours, and trade documents. And that's how all the information around the world of Scientology got to Hubbard through this choke point of these three people, Pat, Annie Broker, and David Miscavige. Well, after Hubbard died, he had written this document that appeared to make Pat and Annie his sort of anointed successors. He called them loyal officers, which is from this interesting OT3 tale. But you can read that document, and I think you would conclude, it looks like he wants them to take over after he's gone. But that's not what happened. And basically, if you've seen film of Pat Broker and talked to people who know him, I don't think he really had the hardcore ruthlessness you need to run Scientology, and David Miscavige did. And so kind of behind the scenes, he pushed Broker out of the way and took over, and there was no one to stop him. So, he's been in charge of Scientology ever since. And he's still a young man. He's only 55, and he's really in total control of everything. And while Hubbard was in hiding, in 81 and 82, he ordered a corporate restructuring where they just completely upended the way Scientology was organized and created a lot of different entities that each had a different part of Scientology. A person that was doing that, it was part of that effort, is a guy named Larry Brennan, who became Denise Brennan, and I got to know Denise. She was a really terrific person. Unfortunately, she died about a year and a half ago. And Denise tells me that there's no question the reason why Hubbard did that reorganization was simply to make it tougher to get to him and his money. In other words, if you sued, it used to be the most powerful entity in the church was something called the Church of Scientology of California. And so people would sue it if they had a beef with Scientology. Well, that's a problem if the Church of Scientology of California controls the lion's share of the money because it's vulnerable.
Sure.
And so what Hubbard did was he came up with these layers. So yeah, go ahead and sue the Church of Scientology International. Go ahead, because it ultimately answers to something called the Religious Technology Center. And if you're going to sue that, it's tougher. It's tougher to get to that next layer. And guess what? There's something beyond the Religious Technology Center called the Church of Spiritual Technology, which you'll never touch. And that's ultimately where the money is controlled. That's why he set this up. Now, some Scientologists will tell you Hubbard was doing this near the end of his life because he wanted to create a more democratic Scientology with checks and balances. But again, Denise Brennan told me, no, that's just nonsense. This was really just a sham setup to keep Hubbard and his money away from the lawsuits. So Miscavige is the chairman of the board of the RTC, and he controls all of these organizations. And it would be, I know there's some Scientologists that would like for those entities to kick him out, but I just don't see it happening.
Quick question.
Great to be here, Ed.
Oh, man, I'm loving this. You have no idea. I was a big... I forgot how much I was so into the Scientology back on using it back in those days. But this is just to be able to talk to you and get all this. Now, what about Miscavige? Did he have an occult background, Miscavige?
No, not really. He was a kid from New Jersey, basically outside of Philly, and...
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
He was asthmatic, and Ron, his dad, had bumped into Dianetics and Scientology and thought it might help his son, and so they took him down, and it seemed to help him, and so they eventually the whole family got into it. He was just a kid. He was just starting high school. He dropped out of high school. They went to England, so David could become an auditor, and ultimately then they ended up in California, and David was... like I said, became like an assistant cameraman for Hubbard as he was making films out in the California desert. So really, I mean, Miscavige has been in Scientology virtually his whole life, and he became it's really a dictatorial leader. But what's one of the things interesting, Mike Renderbrand has brought this up, is that you would expect, with Hubbard, when L. Ron Hubbard ran Scientology, there was no question he was the guy coming up with all the ideas. He was the ultimate auditor and technician, but David Miscavige really doesn't audit anymore, and it's interesting that he's able to stay in control even though he's not a top technical expert. And Scientologists will admit that the ones that are on their way out, that it makes them wonder, why is this guy in charge? They're not even sure why he has a claim to be the leader of the Church of Scientology. It's one of those things that David Miscavige has a real crisis on his hands right now. Because a lot of people that, even though they're still, they have an affinity for Hubbard and his ideas, they're leaving because they just can't take Miscavige's style. That it's just nothing but fundraising and high-pressure tactics. And if you run afoul of him in the organization, he will kick you out, but keep the rest of your family in, and they'll cut off contact from you. It's a snitching culture. It's an interrogation culture. It's just really grim right now, and that's why so many people have been leaving, and I think the Church of Scientology is in a lot of trouble.
Now, what about Miscavige and his own wife? There's some story about that. She was not seen for a long time. What's going on with that?
Yeah, it's something I've been covering for several years, and it's just stunning. Shelley Miscavige, Michelle Barnett was her maiden name. She was a what they call a messenger on the yacht Apollo with Hubbard. She ran around the ship getting him everything he needed, and she worshipped Hubbard. So it was kind of natural that Shelley and Dave, both who both held Hubbard in such high regard, got married. And once Dave rose up the ranks, she did too. So through the 90s, they were running Scientology together, and she was a powerful executive in her own right. And Dave was known for being just really dictatorial and ruthless. But she could be pretty tough herself, and she really dressed people down as well. But I've heard from several people that she also would kind of like try to patch things up with people and try to at least be a little more sympathetic than Dave was. But apparently in 2005, their relationship fell apart in some way, and I've heard the tale told by several different eyewitnesses who were at the base with them at the time. One of them is Mike Rinder. And it was in the summer of 2005 that they started spending some time apart, which was unusual. And then Dave went to the international base, the international management base is in near Hemet, California. They refer to it as either IT base or international base, or people often call it Gold, because the Golden Era Productions studios are out there where they make all their DVDs and stuff. So whether you call it IT base or Gold, that's where, at that time, there were probably 600 or 700 people living there, working there. It's much fewer now. And Miscavige spent a lot of time there, and so did Shelley. But in 2005, Miscavige went to L.A., which is about 90 miles away, and he was working on this book project. And Shelley stayed back at the base. Well, while he was gone, she decided to take care of a couple things that had bothered him, that he complained about all the time, one of which was what they call an org board. And that is that it's one of these things Hubbard came up with, and so they all have to consider it the greatest thing ever. It's just this way of structuring jobs of the organization. And it, for some reason, anytime anybody came up with ideas for who to put in what slot, Miscavige would just shoot it down, saying that's not good enough. But he would berate people that they weren't able to do it. So while he was gone, she took care of it. She filled the job slots. She put people in these different positions there, taken care of. The other thing she took care of while he was gone was he had complained a lot because where he was staying, he wanted renovated. But in order to do that, he was staying in a particular place called the Villas. This international base is a 500-acre compound, the largest building. And the one he was in is called the Villas, and he wanted them renovated. But in order to do that, he needed to get his stuff moved out, and he just never did it. So while he was gone, she had his stuff crated up. I've talked to people who were there who witnessed it and said she did a great job crating everything carefully, getting everything out of those rooms, and then moved him into a temporary space so they could renovate the villas. So he comes back after a few months. The org board has been taken care of. His stuff has been moved, and he just goes ballistic. He's screaming at people about what a bunch of screw-ups they all are, and a week later, Shelley vanished, and she's not been seen in 10 years. Now, we know where she is, okay? And I know this from multiple lines of evidence. The international base, like I said, is near Hemet, and it's secretive, but it's not like, people know it's there, and a lot of people have left there and have told stories about it. But there's another compound up near Lake Arrowhead called the CST headquarters, which is super secret. Most Scientologists had never heard of CST. CST, the Church of Spiritual Technology, is the most secretive group inside of Scientology. CST is this really weird little organization. Its job is to dig vaults, nuclear bomb-proof vaults, to store L. Ron Hubbard's words to last millennia. They've done it in three vaults in California, one vault in New Mexico, and they were working on one in Wyoming, but apparently it's not been completed. And their headquarters is this little compound up near Lake Arrowhead. In a place, some people call it Twin Peaks. Other people that work up there call it Rim Forest, Rim of the World. But basically, it's outside of Lake Arrowhead. There's maybe 15 people working there. There's 10 or 15 little buildings, and there's a vault, and where they store Hubbard stuff. Shelley Miscavige has been there now for 10 years. They let her out just in the summer of 2007 for 2 or 3 days so she could go to her father's funeral. But other than that, she hasn't been seen at any Scientology facilities, Scientology events, or anywhere else in public. And through 3 or 4 different lines of evidence I have, I'm convinced that's where she's been this whole time.
Do you think she's being held against her will?
And that's the question, right? I mean, she worshipped Hubbard, and what they do up there is they work on archiving Hubbard's words. It's clear to me that Dave Miscavige has found a way to banish the wife that he no longer wanted to have anything to do with. But when I broke the news in the summer of 2013 that Leah Remini had left Scientology. And then a month later, I broke the news that she had filed a missing persons report with the LAPD for Shelley Miscavige. Because she had gotten to know Shelley in 2004, and it just, they had started to become friends, and then suddenly she vanished. And in 2006, Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes got married. Leah was invited, and that's when she noticed, David Miscavige was there. Where's his wife? And so she started asking around. Anyway, she leaves Scientology in 2013. She wants to cause a little trouble. She filed a missing person report with the LAPD on a Monday. I find out about it on a Wednesday night. I reported it Thursday morning. The press went crazy with it that day, but by that afternoon, the LAPD was saying, no, this is an unfounded report. And so they kind of made fun of Leah because of that timing, but it wasn't Leah's fault. Leah had filed the missing person report on Monday. I just didn't find out about it until Wednesday night. Anyway, I talked to the Lieutenant Andre Dawson, who said that he had sent 2 detectives to meet with Shelley, and he wouldn't discuss where. But the question I had for him was, and he said that she did not want to make a public statement, but that she was fine. And the thing about a missing persons report, and you would know this, Ed, but the thing about a missing persons report, it's an imperfect way to check on somebody's stats. I mean, all they can do is find out that she's alive, right, and that she's not being held against her will or something. You can't really investigate her situation based on just a missing persons report. So I asked the lieutenant, I said, well, okay, you had 2 detectives meet with her, but when they talked to her, were they in the presence of other church officials? And he very quickly said, that's classified, which I found very strange. And since then, Lieutenant Andre Dawson has regularly appeared as a special guest at Scientology events.
Get out of here.
No, I found various flyers. He's featured in their flyers. So I think that she's up there. I think she's up there. I think the LAPD doesn't care about it, or they're not going to investigate it. But I have to tell you, if you and I somehow got through the gate up there and found her and said, Shelley, you can leave with us if you want to. Do you want to? I'm going to tell you, I don't know what she'd say. She may be resigned to her fate, But I don't think there's any question that David Miscavige, leader of a multi-billion-dollar international organization, has managed to banish his wife to non-existence.
Now, you mentioned earlier Hemet. Now, I had no idea that they were active up there in Hemet. Now, do they control the Hemet government, like the police department and then the mayor's office and stuff like that?
What they do, they don't control it. What they do is what they call safe pointing. And what that means is that, Scientology has various front groups that they use to give the impression that they do a lot of good works. They're fighting drugs. They're fighting illiteracy. They're helping tell people about their human rights. And so they're always like glad-handing the local politicians, giving them tours. And it works. I mean, they have a meeting, for example, particularly in Riverside County where Hemet is. They have these board of supervisors, I think is what they have. And somebody will come before the board of supervisors and say, listen, you've got this camp out there where they're keeping, 15-year-olds working 90 hours a week and they can't leave. And these supervisors have all been out to dinner with, these Scientology leaders and stuff, and they're like, this person sounds like a crazy person. Well, that's on purpose, because Scientology has taken the time to safe point politicians so that when somebody comes forward with these allegations, they sound insane. They do now. I think more and more the word is out, and politicians don't want to have anything to do with Scientology. But in certain places like Riverside County, I think the sheriff there and the board of supervisors are very friendly to Scientology, and it's going to be, you have to go to something like the FBI, and the FBI did do a thorough investigation of Scientology in 2009, 2010. They came very close to raiding that base. I've talked to 4 different people who were informants for the FBI in that investigation. One of them was asked, would you ride in the van with us when we go in and to help to identify people? Another person was told that they had recorded the tail numbers on Tom Cruise's private plane in case the scavengers tried to run that way.
Wow.
So that's how close the FBI came in the summer of 2010 to raiding the base, which I think might have been a big mistake if they had done it. Because the risk that law enforcement runs is if they go into the base and they start trying to free people, quote, free them, these people held in these, we haven't even talked about the hole yet, this bizarre office prison they were running there. If they went in and freed these people, they might say, free us, we're happy where we are. And that's a big problem for law enforcement. So they got cold feet and decided not to do that. But, Mike Rinder, the former spokesman for Scientology, told me that he was glad that they didn't do a raid. He thinks they should do more of like an obstruction of justice type of investigation.
Now, you're saying that the membership is down, but then you say that they have these groups like Al-Anon and these drug... Narconon, right, Narconon. Now, so the people that run Narconon, are they members, like true believers, or are they just hired staff?
They usually are Scientologists, and it doesn't take that many people to run those organizations. It really doesn't. But they have Narconon. Your local Narconon is licensed by Narconon International, which is basically one guy, and he's a lifer, Sea Org guy. And then Narconon International is in turn licensed by this Association for Better Living and Education, ABLE, which employs only Sea Org members, and that's a subsidiary of Scientology. So now the individual staff members at your local Narconon, they tend to be recent graduates. They're addicts struggling to stay clean, and they're the staff. They may not be Scientologists, and they're just part of that local rehab center. But the people running it definitely are Scientologists.
Now, also too, the issue, because you mentioned about how you got 15-year-old kids working over there 12 hours a day and stuff. That's because they have to. You got someone like Tom Cruise; he can afford the classes and the tuition. But if people can't afford that, they make them work it off.
One of the selling points for the Sea Org is that you can get classes at a cheaper rate, but you're working so much you don't have time for courses. And a lot of the Sea Org people join when they're very, very young. The children of Scientologists, the pressure on them starts. There's a really fascinating lawsuit happening in Los Angeles right now. A woman named Laura DiCrescenzo, who was in the Sea Org, she started volunteering for Scientology when she was only 6 or 7 years old. And she signed her billion-year Sea Org contract at the age of 12. And when she started working at 12, she was working 98 hours a week. When she turned 13, they moved her to the adult schedule, which is 112 hours a week.
Oh, my God.
And they get paid, they take home, some weeks they get paid nothing. Other weeks they can get anything from $6 or $7 up to maybe $50. And I think in the movie Going Clear, Tom DeVotte said in 25 years in the Sea Org, he'd never been paid more than $40 for a week's work.
And what kind of work do they have them doing?
It's mostly it's menial labor. Just really they paint buildings and help with construction projects. She was doing paperwork basically. All the grunt work that needs to be done gets done by Sea Org workers, and it's some of them are skilled workers definitely. I mean, Paul Burkhart, the guy that just came out, he was a space planner for their buildings, and so he was doing architectural drawings. So he was definitely a skilled worker, but again, only getting paid pennies an hour, working around the clock, getting screamed at. And I talked to a woman that signed her Sea Org contract at 7 years old.
But all the work they're doing is to support the church and their buildings and their projects.
Oh yeah,
okay.
Yeah, and they're the ones that keep things working.
Okay, you mentioned something called the Hole. What's that about?
Well, so at his base, you had the top management, right? There's all these layers of. Scientology is such an interesting combination of sort of New Age concepts with heavy bureaucracy. It's only in America would somebody turn bureaucracy into a church, but it goes in layers from the local mission to the org, the continental liaison office, et cetera, and then you have these top layers of international management. And so you really made it if you got to int base out at Hemet. This was like only the cream of the crop got to work out there. That's the way they felt anyway. And then they got there and found that Miscavige had made it this really bizarre camp where everyone was miserable, and it got worse and worse to the point in 2004, in January, Miscavige was so sure that his own people were trying to sabotage him, he took a bunch of them and just put them in prison. He turned an office. He put them in the office. He had bars put on the doors and windows, and didn't let them out for years. They were in there for years, Ed. And it became to be called the Hole. It was literally a prison for Scientology executives. Mike Rinder was in there, Marty Rapin, Tom DeVos, Mark Headley, Debbie Cook. I mean, there's no question it exists. Scientology denies it. There's no question that it exists. And it existed from 2004 to 2009. And Debbie Cook testified in court under oath about this, that they slept on the floor. Or I mean, you've worked in an office, and I'm sure you had great coworkers. But imagine if the boss locked the door and you couldn't leave. It wouldn't be so fun, right? Sleeping on the floor, sleeping on desks. During the day, they'd have to write confessions about their crimes. Once a day, they were let out, marched across to the other side of the compound where there were showers. They could take showers. Came back. They were fed slop from 5-gallon buckets. You can see Mike Rinder when he came out of there. He was skeletal. It's hard to believe that this existed in 2005, 2006 in the United States, but it did. He finally had to improve conditions for them after 2009 because the Tampa Bay Times exposed all this in a great, great series called The Truth Rundown. And so it still exists today. Paul Burkhart tells me that they get to sleep in apartments now, but they're still segregated. They're still considered to be in the hole. They're still basically in a prison detail. And this is part of the reason why the FBI was thinking about raiding the place and freeing these people.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like much of a question. Now, did anybody try to escape?
Yes, Marty Rapid escaped. After a few days, he couldn't. He said there's no way he could put up with that. He escaped. Mike Rinder was in for more than a year, but then he was suddenly pulled out, and because Miscavige needed him to handle John Sweeney when John Sweeney was making a documentary in 2007 called Scientology and Me. And if you watch that documentary, look at Rinder's face, you will see it. The man has not eaten properly in a year. He's so gone. And he said that was it. He couldn't take it anymore. He was in England after that, and he took off rather than be sent back to the hole. And but as far as other people escaping from the hole, it's tough to get out of that place. There have been some very interesting, amazing escapes from that base. Mark Headley and Claire Headley is one of the most interesting, and Mark wrote about that in his book, Blown for Good. It's a great book.
Back to Hemet for 1 second. So now, if you live in Hemet, let's say today, or even 5-10 years ago, and you're a kid and you're in middle school, would it be likely that most of the kids in your classroom would be related to Scientology in some way?
That's a good question, because I know early in its history, the people who worked at int base actually did live off base. And so there's a chance, but I don't think there's much interaction between the people who. First of all, I think the population of the base is way down now.
Okay.
And they don't leave the base now. Now there's apartments on the base, so they don't leave. So there's very little interaction between the Scientologists at the base and the other people that live in the area.
So they would have their own schools too, where the kids would go to school?
I don't think there are any kids at int base.
Okay. Sea
Org members are not allowed to have children.
Oh, really?
From
Never.
From around 1982, when the Tampa Bay Times exposed this, Sea Org women who got pregnant were forced to have an abortion.
Really? Now,
Yeah.
someone's asking a question in the chat about Saboba Indian Reservation.
I'm sorry?
Someone's asking in the chat room about Saboba Indian Reservation.
Well, there was. I think they might be referencing something that used to be called Happy Valley, which
Right.
is another piece of land that Scientology owned not far from it, and they used as kind of a prison compound called Happy Valley. But they sold that years ago. They don't control that anymore.
Okay. Now, what about all this stuff about, you've heard of the Process Church of the Final Judgment, the DeGrimsons?
There are a lot of spin-offs from Scientology, a lot. I mean, Werner Erhard
Right.
was basically a spin-off from Scientology. And I don't know a lot about the Process Church, but it's my understanding that it included some people that had left Scientology that gave it their own spin. And that's pretty common. That's happened a lot of different times.
Now, but these DeGrimsons, they had to be high up in Scientology, because I actually saw a memo by Hubbard where he said these two are fair game now. They've left and they've made a bad name. They're fair game.
Right. Well, he did that with anybody. I mean, you didn't necessarily need to be high up to become fair game by Hubbard. He was so offended by the idea. This is the other thing that there are still long-time Scientologists that say it's a science. The thing about a science is you can replicate the results
right
by someone else. So if Hubbard really truly did discover something real about the human mind, and it's a science, then other people can come up with the same results, but they can't. It all has to go through Hubbard, and Hubbard enforced that ruthlessly with his ethics rules. And so people would leave and then start doing their own brand of Scientology. It drove him crazy. And he would go after them, even if it was just, I mean, you've picked the most sensational one, but there are many other small groups, people that left, tried to form their own versions with various names, and Hubbard would go after them and threaten them and harass them. He wanted to have it all under his control. And of course, you asked about Charlie Manson. That's the one thing Scientology has complained about my book, which is so funny to me, because Paulette did write about Manson in her book, and so I mentioned it in mine, and they don't like that. But there's no question. I don't know. Did you see this? Did you see this new book about Manson by Jeff Gwynne that came out last year?
No, I have not.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
It's really good. It's a really Jeff Gwynne started from scratch and just really dug into Charlie Manson's life, and it's a fantastic book, great read. And one of the things Jeff Gwynne did was, of course, he went to the prison in the Bay Area where in Manson State, Washington State, I think, that he was in from 63 to 66, I think it was. And that's when he was heavily into Scientology. And we know that because the warden was saying, well, thank goodness Charlie's into something. They thought it was a good thing that Charlie was into Scientology. And there's no question that Charlie Manson audited in prison. Now, when he got out, he didn't go run to the Church of Scientology. He created his own thing. He created some ideas from Scientology, some ideas from others, and you can look at how he created the family, basing ideas from a number of different places. But there's no question that some of the what he used came from his experience with Scientology, and the Church of Scientology really hates it when you bring that up. But there's just no question that Charlie was in Scientology at least for several years.
I had no idea that he was did the thing audited in prison. Now, what about names? You hear about names like Mark David Chapman, that he was associated with Scientology. What do you know about that?
There's an interesting story which I want to look into more, that Mark David Chapman, and this is the guy that shot Lennon, right?
Yeah.
The story I've heard, and I don't know if there's much to it, I do want to look into it, was that it wasn't that he was in Scientology, but that he was known by some Scientologists in that neighborhood, that the local mission there, the org, they knew him because they knew he was such a nut. And they didn't say anything. And so I want to look into that and see if I can find something about that. But that's as far as I know. Maybe there's more to it than that, but I I have to admit I don't know a lot about it.
Well, I believe that apartment that he lived in Hawaii was right across the street from the Scientology Center.
Yes.
Right.
It was real close, and they knew him, and that they. I just heard this story that apparently the Scientologists knew that he was a dangerous guy, but they didn't do anything about it. But I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't looked into it.
That's very interesting. Okay. Got to look into that. Okay. Now, what about David Berkowitz? Because I heard also, too, that even when he got arrested, that he had a phone number of a high-ranking Scientologist in his pocket. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't.
Okay. What about the O.J. Simpson trial? Seems like a lot of people involved in the O.J. Simpson trial. Greta Van Susteren, she's Scientologist, right?
Yep, she sure is.
And what about Marsha Clark? She was Scientologist?
No, but she was married to one.
Right. Now, there was something with Marsha Clark, her ex-husband, that he was shot by the pastor that married them. Do you know that story?
I don't know that story.
Yeah, her ex-husband was shot by his Scientologist pastor. By a member of, who performed their wedding. That's what it was.
I'll have to look that one up.
Now, you can get married in a Scientologist church, in a Scientologist ceremony?
Sure, absolutely. L. Ron Hubbard wrote the various ceremonies for naming a child, marriage ceremony. Tom Cruise and Mimi Rogers were married on May 9th, 1987. That's Dianetics Day, man. I mean, definitely Scientologists like to do things that way.
What about, was O.J. Simpson ever a Scientologist?
He talked about it. I remember there was an interview. I remember seeing him on a golf cart with, I think, a British journalist asking him about that, and he said something about going clear, but he said it in a way that I have a feeling he was just a dabbler and didn't really know what he was talking about.
So what else is going on today in current day Scientology? Do you still think it's a dangerous group? They're still holding these people prisoner in these spots, right?
I think there's a lot of things to be concerned about with Scientology. Like I said, most of the young field members now grew up in Scientology. They still sign billion-year contracts. They're working around the clock. Families are being ripped apart when somebody gets kicked out of the Church of Scientology. They're still using the same old surveillance techniques, Ed. A private investigator just went to federal prison because he was caught trying to hack me and Mike Rinder on behalf of the Church of Scientology. So, I mean, they really haven't changed their techniques all that much in 50 years. So it's a group that's, I think it's smaller than people expect it to be, but it controls billions of dollars. It affects a lot of lives. It's ripping families apart, and I think it deserves to be watched the way it's being watched.
What about your book, The Unbreakable Miss Lovely? Now, what's that? What story is that?
Paul, as I said, fair game. They've gone after journalists over the years, but when you start writing about Scientology, the number one question you get is, well, you know what they do to journalists? You heard what they did to Paulette Cooper, don't you? I mean, Paulette's very famous as being the journalist that got harassed the most by the Church of Scientology. She came out with a book in 1971 called The Scandal of Scientology. It was the most harsh book written about Scientology to that time. And L. Ron Hubbard just decided to destroy her. And they spent years and multiple operations trying to ruin her life. Like I said, at one point they got to the point where she was indicted, facing 15 years in federal prison for making bomb threats that she had not made. The Church of Scientology had framed her for. All that came out later in the FBI raid. They got documents showing that she'd been framed. But they kept going after her with more and more operations. I think that's one of the things that my book explored that previous accounts of her online had not. They were still running operations against her in the 80s. And I found out that they were still keeping tabs on her as recently as 2012. So she's a really amazing person. Also part of the book is that she had survived the Holocaust as a child in a really interesting way. And bring her up to date to what she's doing now. She's a really amazing person, and I was so fortunate when the book came out last year. We decided to do a book tour in California and other places, and she went with me, and I think audiences loved her. She's just She's totally unapologetic. She's just as critical of Scientology today as she ever was. And she totally resents the fact that 15 years of her life were taken away. Just always, she came very close to killing herself.
Oh my God!
When it looked like she was going to go to trial and her career was going to be ruined. And it was really fantastic working with her. I spoke. I spent 2 years on that book. I spoke with her. I went to visit her and spoke to her a lot. But I also found these other people that had taken part back in those days. So Christine Hansen, the FBI agent, I tracked her down. I called her up, and she was telling me these stories that were amazing. And I said, "Has a reporter ever even asked you about this before?" She said, "No." And that happened a couple of other times. People that I interviewed that had never been interviewed before. Paulette's attorney for her that helped exonerate her when she was being, tried for these bomb threats. They had never given an interview before. They talked to me, but the thing that I really wanted to find were these former spies that had worked for the Church of Scientology, and I talked to several of them. It was very contentious with some of them. Some of them did not want to cooperate with me. Others would, but they had conditions, which is fine. I mean, that's how it works. And I was just really glad that they told me what they did, and so it was great to get that perspective from the other side as well in there. And the Church of Scientology itself, at that time, wrote lengthy, articles about Paulette with their side of things. So I had the Church's side in there, and it was just a great experience putting all that together and telling her story properly for the first time. And it's complex. I mean, she made some mistakes. She wasn't always making the best decisions back then, and she'd walk into traps a couple times. But she's fun to root for because she's just always she always said that part of what motivated her was that she'd lost her mother and father at Auschwitz, and she just said if more people had spoken up in the 30s, maybe things would have been different. And she saw in America here was this totalitarian organization that was harming people, and she said, I've got to speak up. So I just really admire that about her.
Yeah, that's a real hero, yeah. Now, when they were going after you, and you said they were hacking into your computer, when did this hacking thing go on?
That was just very recently. I got the book came out. I think the official date was May 14th last year, and 10 days later, I got a notification from the U.S. Attorney's Office that they wanted to talk to me, and I was like, "Uh-oh, what's going on?"
Uh-oh.
and it turns out that this private investigator had been the FBI was actually investigating something else, and they ran into this guy and realized that he had been using overseas hackers and was selling their services. And so he would basically tell clients, "Listen, you want somebody's email? I can get them for you." And so he had then attempted to hack several people, and the U.S. Attorney's Office was then contacting them, and they contacted me. Well, I had actually caught the guy spoofing me a couple years before. Spoofing is when somebody sends out emails under your name.
Right. And
he had made a little mistake, and the emails he was sending out under my name actually came back to me. And so I caught him, and I called him up, and I said, "What are you doing?" And he invented this long story that my attorney and I didn't believe for a minute. But we couldn't see any Scientology connection, and he denied any, so we kind of let the matter drop. And this time when the U.S. Attorney's Office came back to me and said, "Listen, we're now prosecuting this guy," I asked him again. I said, "Well, I have no evidence that he ever actually breached in my computer and never got any data, but I am curious about the fact that you're prosecuting him. Do you know if he was working for the Church of Scientology?" They said, "We don't know." My attorney contacted the name of the private investigator is Eric Saldarriaga, and Saldarriaga's attorney talked to my attorney. And again, we asked him, "Listen, were you working for the Church of Scientology when you were trying to get Ortega's data?" And he said, No. But then, just a few days before the sentencing, I found out from Mike Rinder that he had been contacted by the church, by the U.S. Attorney. Mike Rinder is the former top international spokesman for the Church of Scientology, and he was also victimized by Eric Saldarriaga. At that point, we realized there's no question. There's only one organization on earth that wants to hack into the computers of Tony Ortega and Mike Rinder, okay? And the New York Times dug into it and did report that Saldarriaga was working for the Church of Scientology. And he was sentenced to, I don't know, it was like 3 months in federal prison.
Yeah.
It was a very short time. I think he's already done it. But, for me, it was important because here I had just come out with a book saying that this is what they do to journalists. This is what they put Paulette Cooper through. They did all these illegal things to her. They claim now that they use no more illegal techniques. They might surveil people, but it's all legal. And yet, 10 days after my book comes out, we found out that they had hacked me illegally or tried to. And they're using the same old techniques. They were proving my point for me.
Now, what else? Any threats, surveillance, being followed? And did they ever try and pay you off and bribe you?
They've never tried to bribe me, but they have harassed me over the years. I mean, I tended to dodge that question before, but then Alex Gibney asked me about it for the movie Going Clear, and it's Alex Gibney, so I did tell him in the movie that twice Scientology's chief dirty tricks private investigator showed up at my mother's front door in California.
Oh, really?
It was purely an intimidation attempt, And then a couple of weeks ago, I was in California visiting my mom, and I got called by a Church of Scientology reporter with its magazine, which never happens. And the first thing he asked me was about an event my mother and I had attended. And so I said, "Oh, so you're letting me know you're spying on me and my mom? That's great." And so, that was just a couple of weeks ago. So it's just something I put up with, and I just brush it off. I mean, you can be real paranoid about it, and you can let it upset you, but that's what they want. And I just not to let them upset me. I just, okay, they're going to watch me, they're going to try to mess with me, but you know what? All I'm doing is calling people, getting their stories, checking the facts, and writing down what I've learned, and that's all I'm doing. And if they want to try to stop me, they can try.
Okay, we're getting down to the last 15 minutes. What about his friendship with Arthur C. Clarke? What do you know about that? Hubbard and Clarke.
Hubbard and Clarke, gosh, man, you're really testing me tonight. I don't really know. I know that he got to know all the figures back then, and he was friends with L. Sprague de Camp and Robert Heinlein. Heinlein he was probably closest with of all the other science fiction writers. He knew Isaac Asimov.
Really?
But, I don't know that it's the only one that really thought Dianetics was great, got into it, was A.E. Van Vogt, who I love his early books. And he really got into Dianetics, but he wouldn't get into Scientology. In other words, he was okay with the idea of going back to the womb to figure out what had harmed you, but he would not go to past lives. He thought that was nonsense. And so for 40 years after that, A.E. Van Vogt was still very dedicated to Dianetics, but he would never go to Scientology. But I don't know what Hubbard's connection with Clarke was.
What about the director of The Shining? What's his name?
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Yeah.
I'm blanking.
Well, we both know who we're talking about. We both know who we're talking about. Was he connected with the...
No, but his daughter is. I'm trying to remember.
Okay.
I've written this whole story, multiple
Kubrick.
stories about
Stanley
her.
Kubrick.
Yeah, and her name is Anyway, Stanley Kubrick's daughter got heavily into Scientology in the late 90s, and it really broke his heart because he was grooming her, Vivian Kubrick. And he was grooming her to take over and become a great filmmaker of her own right. When he made 2001, for example, she was a little girl on the set. But then when he made Full Metal Jacket, she made a documentary of it. She was on the set making her own film about him making the movie.
Right.
And she also did the music for some of his films. She was becoming, and so he was super proud that she did music for the film, she made films of her own, and then she joined Scientology and gave it up. He had offered her to do a score for Eyes Wide Shut, and she turned him down because she had gotten involved with Scientology. And it broke his heart. He wrote this long letter to her about how, this, and remember, he was very near the end of his life at that point. And his other family members say he died of a broken heart, man. He was really bummed out in those last years that his daughter had turned her back on him. It's interesting because there's no question that Vivian became very involved in Scientology, but they usually make kind of ornaments of their celebrities, like Travolta and Cruz. But a lot of these former Scientologists that have come out, these big executives, I asked them about her, and they're like, "Who's that?" But for some reason, she got into it, but Scientology didn't make a big deal about it. And she's definitely still in. She started. I wrote about her because she showed up at an Alex Jones rally in Dallas, and he was beside himself. He's like, "Wow, this is the daughter of Stanley Kubrick." Now it was clear that Alex Jones had no idea about her Scientology involvement because he was just jazzed that I get to talk to the daughter of this great man, right? And then she started a Twitter account at that point, and she was talking about Alex Jones, and she started, for a little while, she was tweeting these amazing photos from being on the set with her dad. Wow. And I was trying to get in contact with her. I was trying to ask her about it. She blocked me, and I don't know where she is now, but her family is really, really sad about it.
Okay, everybody in the chat room's nagging me now. They say, ask about Pat Broker.
Yeah, I told you about Pat and Eddie Broker. They were the two that were living with Hubbard at the ranch in California near the end of his life.
Okay, yeah, I don't want to.
Oh, you want to know what? They probably want to know what happened since then. So yeah, so David Miscavige muscled Pat Broker out of the way. Broker took off on his own. What Miscavige, though, he was always afraid that Broker would be able to challenge him for the leadership of Scientology or whatever. Miscavige decided he wanted to have eyes on Broker all the time. He hired two former cops in 1988 to follow Pat Broker around the clock. They followed Broker for 24 years. Scientology paid $10 to $12 million so that these two guys, Paul Merrick and Greg Arnold, would follow Broker no matter where he went. For a while, Broker was over in the Czech Republic. These two cops made sure there were spies watching him. He came back to the United States. He taught college. They watched him. They were always watching him. And they were using some really interesting techniques that they revealed to me, because what happened was they ultimately got fired and claimed that they hadn't been given jobs for life, and so they sued. And so for one day, they talked to me, and then they talked to the reporters from the Tampa Bay Times, and that's it. Once Scientology found out they were talking to us, they offered a settlement to end the lawsuit. But during that one day, they told me all these stories about what it was like to follow this guy. One of the things they did as Scientology Private Eye, when Pat Broker was living in, I think it was Paso Robles, they rented the house next door.
Wow.
And Paul, and then installed one, and then had one of their girlfriends live there. Okay? Then Paul recruited his dad to become Broker's friend by running into him at a bar over and over again. And so it worked, and Pat became friends with Paul's dad. At the next Christmas, Paul had his dad give Pat a cordless phone as a gift. Now, this was 88, 89, and back then, now, this is a cordless phone, not a cell phone. A cordless phone, the way it works is there's a little weak radio signal between the base and the handset, right? And they had researched this. In California in 1988, it was not illegal to listen in on that radio signal and record it, even without the knowledge of the person using the phone. So they rented the house next door, gave him the cordless phone, and recorded every phone call he made on it for the next couple of years.
Incredible.
That's the kind of there's two kinds of surveillance Scientology does. The one thing is called a noisy investigation. That's when they show up at your mom's house, right? That they're not going to get information from my mom. The whole point is just to unsettle me, to intimidate, right? That's called a noisy investigation. In a noisy investigation, They want you to know you're being investigated. The other kind of investigation they do is the kind they did with American Arnold, where they followed with Pat Brogan for 24 years, and their job was never let him know he's being followed. So they would always watch from a distance. They would record from next door. They were professionals, and Pat never knew these guys were, on the next block watching him do a telescope or whatever. Yeah, so those are the two different kinds of things they do, and that's what they were doing. That's what David Miscavige was having two private investigators do to his own father recently, and they were caught. I don't know if you know that story.
No, I don't. We're down to about 5 minutes, 6 minutes. What do you want to tell us about that? Yeah, what do you want to tell us about that? And however you want.
Okay, Ron Miscavige Sr. is David's father. Ron got his son into Scientology. But Ron became disaffected and escaped from the national base in March of 2012. David then put two private eyes on a father-son team, Dwayne and Daniel Powell, on his own father to do the whole, like American Arnold did. Watch him, don't let him know you're watching him. They were watching him. They were getting paid $10,000 a week. The reason we know that was one day, and Ron was living in Wisconsin, and one of his neighbors called the cops on the PIs just because she thought she didn't know who they were, and they were acting suspicious. When the police arrived, they asked to search the car. These guys had an arsenal in their car. And, they had an assault rifle, they had handguns, they had tons of ammunition, which I think was just because they were your typical American gun enthusiasts, right? I don't think they had any thoughts of harming Ron at all. I think they just liked guns. But the reason they were in trouble was not because they had all these guns and all this ammunition, but because they had a PVC pipe silencer, homemade, for the assault rifle. They were facing 10 years in federal prison for that. And so they sang like canaries. That's why we know. I have the full tapes of their interviews on my website. You can listen to them. You'll get paid $10,000 a week to watch Ron Miscavige, to try to get friends to befriend him to become spies. All the same stuff American Arnold were doing with Pat Broker. They were doing to Ron Miscavige Sr., David's father, just a couple of years ago. This was broken by the LA Times last year. And it, again, shows that they just don't change the way they work. And now Ron has a book coming out on May 3rd called Ruthless about his own son, and this is going to be one of the main anecdotes, I'm sure, is how he was followed by PIs.
Oh, that's going to be huge.
Yeah. It's going to be Dan Harris on 2020 is going to interview Ron on Friday night, April 29th, and then the book will come out on May 3rd.
So I was going to ask you about Xenu. Do you think you have time to...
2 hours on Scientology, we didn't even talk about Xenu. And I'll tell you what, that's a good thing, because I know everyone knows Xenu and South Park, and it's wonderful, but it's really not. I mean, there's such much more important things in Scientology than Xenu. The splitting apart of families, the way people are treated in the Sea Org, the incredible prices, the way people are bankrupted, all of that is much more important than Xenu, but Xenu's fun. There's no question.
Yeah, I had Arnaldo Lerma on the show, and he talked about how they got into his bathroom and put LSD in his toothpaste.
There's no question Arnie was, he was raided and they treated terribly. There's a former Guardian's office operative who admitted that they put LSD in a toothpaste, but he was talking about targeting a woman. I don't know. If Arnie says that they did that to them, maybe he did. I don't know.
Okay, I might have got the story wrong, but I think that's what he told me. Okay, Tony Ortega. The website is TonyOrtega.org. The Underground Bunker. The book is The Unbreakable Miss Lovely. We got a couple of minutes left. What do you want to leave us with? How can people find you if they want to give you information or something?
Yeah, come to TonyOrtega.org. I have something about Scientology every day. I try to have something new that's never been online before, an interview or something, and just an absolutely wonderful, I'm very fortunate to have an absolutely wonderful commenting crew there, really knowledgeable folks. We have some very important people that are in the comments there answering questions, and always a lot of fun. I have a new story up every morning at 7 a.m., sometimes have a second story in the afternoon, and we've broken some big stories on that website. Leah Remini leaving Scientology, and it's just a lot of other things you heard first, The Underground Bunker. So it's fun, and I enjoy it. And then, my book, The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, is available in the United Kingdom and Canada, the United States, and Australia. It's on Amazon, and it's easy to find, and I hope you enjoy it. I tried to write it, as as if it was happening. I tell it as a tale. It's a narrative. It's not, an academic book at all. And I think people enjoy that part of it.
And years ago, you first exposed Sheriff Joe Arpaio?
Well, I was one of the journalists. Yeah, I started working as a journalist in Phoenix in 1995. John Doherty actually wrote the first story about Arpaio for the Phoenix New Times way back in like 93. And then I got to start writing about him in 95. I wrote about Arpaio for 4 years, from 95 to 99. And, it was just very obvious then. He says one thing to the public, but what's really going on in his office and his jail is very different. And, he talks tough, but he wastes a lot of county money, and he's just, I'm just amazed that he's still in office. People are getting maimed and killed in his jails who are just awaiting trial.
Yeah, I know. So what do you think when you see him up there with Trump being I
tell you, I think they're made for each other. It really. I know Joe real well, and I know how he talks. And when I saw the two of them together, I thought, of course, they're a natural pair.
A match made in hell. I tell you, I got to take my hat off to you. You're not afraid to take on some of the toughest people in the world. Especially if you lived in Arizona in Maricopa County while you were taking on Arpaio.
He once. I heard from a top deputy in the. I had some great sources that worked for him, and he said that Arpaio once told his vice crew he'd give anybody a bonus that caught Ortega with a hooker. Yeah. And so I. Sorry, Joe.
Well, that's one way to become celibate, I guess. To kind of keep yourself.
It's just one of those hazards with God. These guys need watching, and somebody's got to do it.
Well, Tony Ortega, thank you so much, man. I tell you, I really enjoyed this, man. I've always wanted to do a real Scientology show, and you're the guy, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, Ed. I really appreciate it. That's a great question.
I'm going to beg you to come back.
I'd be happy to.
And I got your number, so I'm not going to stop calling. Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much, Tony Ortega.
Have a good.
Good night.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18 plus.